What we saw yesterday were the most incredible arguments born of desperation. Arguments that, if the senators ever followed, would lead this country down the most destructive path. Yesterday, the president's defenders argued that a president of the United States could do essentially whatever he wanted to secure his reelection, no matter how corrupt, if he believed that his reelection was in the national interest. As the president's lawyers argued, if the president does a quid pro quo, even one where he withholds military aid from an ally at war, even if he takes actions that jeopardize our national security and the integrity of our elections, as long as he thinks it's in his reelection interest, that's okay, and there's nothing that Congress can do about it. And what's more, if part of that quid pro quo involves an investigation of his political rival, the fact that his political rival is running for president gives it greater legitimacy, not less, because it would be more consequential. That is the most absurdly dangerous argument that could have been made. And the fact that they must resort to this level of desperation is the result of the fact that the House managers proved the defendant's scheme involved withholding of military aid, withholding of a coveted White House meeting with the president of Ukraine in order to coerce, to extort, to blackmail that country into conducting or announcing these sham investigations, to helping him cheat in the election. They went on to say that soliciting, inviting, coordinating foreign assistance in a U.S. election, notwithstanding what the FBI director says, or any self-respecting American says, that they view that as perfectly fine. It is the normalization of lawlessness. But that is what they've had to resort to as the evidence has continued to pile up of the president's guilt. And when that evidence threatened to get even greater with the testimony of John Bolton, they have gone to extraordinary lengths to put a muzzle on John Bolton, to avoid calling him as a witness, to avoid letting the American people hear what he has to say, to trying to stifle his book, to attacking him publicly, because they fear what he has to say, because they already know the president's scheme has been exposed. So that's where they are. We will continue today to make the case, a case that has already been made to the American people, but needs to be made to this Senate, and that is a fair trial requires witnesses. Fair trial, an impartial oath requires witnesses. And that's what they should deliver for the American people. No trial, no vindication. No vindication for the president or anyone else. The Constitution requires a fair trial, and that's all we're asking.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.